Ever get that feeling like, like the universe is trying to tell you something? Maybe you keep running into the same person or you have a dream and then it kind of comes true.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah. So today we're taking a deep dive into those weird coincidences, and we're calling it synchronicity. We're going to be exploring what might be going on, going beyond just regular cause and effect. And to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be using excerpts from Carl Jung's book, Synchronicity, an Acausal connecting principle.
It's fascinating how Jung approached these experiences. I mean, instead of dismissing them, he actually gave them a name, synchronicity.
Right.
And he saw it as this, like, potentially powerful force in the universe, just as important as cause and effect. He even went so far as to define synchronicity as, quote, a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation.
So is it like magic? Is that what he's
Yeah.
saying?
Not quite. It's more like maybe there are connections between events that aren't just the typical this leads to that, like A leads to B kind of linear thinking. Jung argued that synchronicity is really about meaning, not just causality.
Okay, I think I get that. But can you give me, like, an example?
Okay, so think about it this way. With causality, it's like you've got a train and it's following the same tracks, every single time.
Yeah, okay.
With synchronicity, it's more like you have these two separate trains and they just happen to arrive at the same station at the same time, totally by
Oh, I
chance.
like that.
One of Jung's famous examples is when a patient was telling him about a dream she had about this golden scarab beetle.
Hmm.
And as she's talking, a real beetle flies into his office window.
No way.
Yeah. Remarkably similar to the one in her dream. And to Jung, this wasn't just a random coincidence. It was like this synchronistic event that was full of meaning.
That's crazy. Has anything like that ever happened to you?
Well, I've never had a beetle fly into my office, but I've definitely had moments where, it felt like the universe was trying to tell me something. What about you? Have you ever had something happen that just seemed like more than just a
Oh,
coincidence?
yeah, totally. One time I had this dream about a friend I hadn't seen in years. And then literally the next day, they reached out to me out of the blue. I
Wow.
was like, whoa, is this real life right now? You know, it made me question if there's really more to reality than we see. But if these events aren't connected by cause and effect, then what is connecting them?
Well, Jung believed that synchronicity often points to something much deeper, maybe even something operating beyond our normal ideas of time and space.
Hmm.
He even suggested it could be our unconscious mind's way of communicating with us. Like those times you get this sudden urge to call someone and they're like, I was just thinking about you.
Yeah.
Or maybe you feel this like sudden sense of dread and then later you find out something bad actually happened to someone you care about. Jung thought that these could be examples of the unconscious mind breaking through, kind of like breaking through those everyday boundaries of how we usually perceive things.
That's a pretty big idea, especially for back then when he was writing all this.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It was a challenge to the scientific thinking of his day. Back then, and even now, science focuses a lot on the material world. And there's this, like, emphasis on strict cause and effect laws. So there wasn't much room then, and there still isn't a lot of room, for things that don't fit neatly into those explanations.
Yeah.
But Jung, being a psychiatrist, he was working with the human psyche, with dreams and symbolism and, all the depths of the unconscious mind. He saw firsthand that there were these patterns and connections that you just couldn't explain using traditional science.
So he was basically saying, hey, there's more to the story here than just the physical world. Like, we need to pay attention to the things that don't fit in our neat little scientific boxes.
Exactly. And to kind of illustrate that point, he often used examples from nature that defied those simple cause and effect explanations.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
One that really fascinated him was this creature called the Pololo worm.
The Pololo worm. I don't think I've heard of that.
They're these tiny sea creatures,
Hmm.
and they have this like incredibly synchronized mating ritual.
Really?
Yeah, so they all swarm to the ocean surface at a very precise time each year.
Wow. How do they do that?
Well, that's the thing. There aren't any obvious external cues like changes in temperature or light that are triggering this behavior. It's
That's
like
helpful.
they all have this internal clock, and it's all synchronized to some mysterious force that we don't fully understand.
So are you saying, like, even in nature, there are hints that synchronicity could be at play?
It's a possibility, right? I mean, these worms are operating on a level that we can barely comprehend. And it really makes you wonder what else might be going on that we just don't have a grasp on yet.
Yeah, it makes you think. And if something like that exists out in nature, could it also exist, like, within us?
That's a question that Jung explored in depth, especially when he was looking at cases where the unconscious mind seemed to be operating outside the normal limitations of space and time.
So are we talking about things like, premonitions or psychic abilities, that kind of stuff?
Not necessarily. Jung was really fascinated by cases, documented cases, where people like in comas or who had near-death experiences later could accurately describe things that happened around them while they were supposedly unconscious. It really makes you wonder about like what consciousness even is and what its limits are.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories about people who've had near-death experiences and claim to have seen things they shouldn't have been able to.
Yeah.
But is it possible that those experiences could be explained by something other than synchronicity?
Well, that's the tough question, right? How do we know what's a real synchronicity thing and what has some other explanation? Even Jung struggled with that. He wanted to find ways to like study synchronicity in a more objective, scientific way.
I can see how that would be hard because synchronicity seems so, like, subjective. How do you even start to study something like that?
Well, Jung was really drawn to the I Ching, which is that ancient Chinese book of divination.
Oh, the I Ching, right. That's the one where you, like, throw coins or yarrow stalks, and then you consult these hexagrams for insight. I've always found it kind of mystical and a little bit hard to grasp, honestly. How did Jung connect it to synchronicity?
Well, the I Ching is all about this idea that everything's interconnected, and those events that we see as random can actually show us these underlying patterns and meanings. Jung thought that the I Ching might be a system that could actually tap into how synchronicity works, offering us a glimpse into that interconnected web of meaning. He thought it could give us some insights into the unconscious mind and how it connects to these synchronistic events.
So was he using the I Ching just to interpret those, like, individual moments of synchronicity? Or was he going for something a bit more scientific?
He was interested in both, really. I mean, he did use the I Ching in his own personal life, but he also wanted to find more empirical ways to study synchronicity. That actually led him to a pretty unexpected area, astrology.
Astrology? Wait, like horoscopes and zodiac signs? I thought we were talking about a scientist.
He was a scientist and he had a healthy dose of skepticism about astrology, for sure. But he was also fascinated by this, age-old belief that our lives are somehow influenced by events that are happening out there in the cosmos. Jung saw a chance to maybe see if there was any actual evidence to support these ancient beliefs.
Okay, I'm curious. How do you even go about studying astrology scientifically?
Well, he actually did a big statistical analysis
So,
looking at the astrological charts of hundreds of married couples.
so he was testing the idea that maybe, like, certain planetary alignments are linked to marriage. Like, if two people's charts have a lot of those alignments, they're more likely to get married.
Exactly. He zeroed in on what astrologers call conjunctions, which are when two planets appear close together in the sky, from our perspective on Earth. Traditional astrology says that certain conjunctions, particularly those involving the sun and moon, are connected to marriage. Jung wanted to see if there was any statistical basis for that idea.
And what did he find? Did he end up proving that astrology is actually legit science?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. At first, his results seemed to support those traditional astrological ideas. When he looked at data from the first group, 180 couples, he found what seemed like a statistically improbable number of sun-moon conjunctions in their charts. It suggested that maybe there was something to this idea of celestial influences on relationships.
Wow, so he actually found evidence that kind of backed up astrology. That's surprising. What happened next?
Well, like any good scientist, Jung wanted to make absolutely sure his results weren't just some kind of fluke. So he kept going with his experiment, analyzing even more data, bigger data sets. But as he did, something strange happened. The statistical significance of those initial findings started to go down. Eventually, it became statistically insignificant. Basically, the more data he collected, the less it supported that original astrological hypothesis.
Oh, man, that's a bummer. I was getting excited about the idea that maybe our love lives are, like, written in the stars.
Yeah.
So what did Jung think about these, contradictory results? Did he just decide astrology was a bunch of nonsense?
He didn't quite dismiss it like that. Instead of just saying those initial findings were a mistake, he started to think about the role of the observer in all of this. He wondered if the expectations of the person doing the experiment could have actually played a part in shaping the results they count.
You're saying that even when we try to be scientific and objective, our own, like, hopes and biases can influence what we see.
It's definitely possible. Think of it like this. Let's say you're really looking for a specific kind of car, and then suddenly you start seeing them everywhere. Were they always there, or did you start noticing them more because you were focused on finding them? Jung suggested that maybe something like that was happening in his astrology experiment. He and his assistant were really eager to find evidence for synchronicity. And maybe, just maybe, that excitement kind of unconsciously influenced how they saw the data.
Oh, I see what you mean. So maybe they were more likely to pay attention to data that supported their theory and maybe downplay or even overlook data
Hmm.
that didn't really fit. Like they were accidentally influencing the experiment just by observing it.
Exactly. And that points to one of Jung's most important ideas about synchronicity, that the observer and the observed aren't actually separate. They're, in a sense, kind of intertwined. Everything we see, everything we experience, it all gets filtered through our own individual psyche, our beliefs, our expectations. That means even when we're trying our best to be scientific, those subjective factors can still creep in.
That's really trippy.
Yeah.
If our own expectations can have that much influence, even in science, what does that mean for our ability to truly, objectively understand the world around us?
It's a huge question. And it gets to the heart of why synchronicity is so tough to study. If we're always influencing what we observe, how can we separate those influences from the actual phenomenon? It's here that Jung's idea of the, what he called a causal connecting principle, becomes super important. He was suggesting that there's this deeper underlying principle that connects events, but in a way that goes beyond our normal understanding of cause and effect.
So are you saying that instead of just asking what caused this to happen, we should be asking what does this event mean and how does it fit in with other things happening in my life?
That's a great way to put it. Synchronicity encourages us to shift our perspective, to move away from just looking at things through a purely causal lens and start considering meaning and interconnectedness.
This whole idea of synchronicity really shakes things up. It challenges a lot of our assumptions about how the world works. I mean, if it's real, what does it mean for things like free will or fate or even the nature of reality itself?
Those are some of the biggest questions we face as humans. And while Jung didn't claim to have all the answers, he believed that synchronicity could give us new ways of thinking about these age-old mysteries.
Okay, so looking ahead, how should we approach this whole idea of synchronicity? Is it something that we can try to make happen, or is it more about just being open to it when it occurs?
I think it's less about forcing it and more about just becoming aware of how connected everything really is. It's about being open to the possibility that maybe there's more to those coincidences than we might initially think. Pay attention to those times when things just seem to click into place, when something that seems random suddenly feels like it has deeper meaning, or when you feel a strong connection to something or someone and you just can't explain why.
It's like those moments are little winks from the universe, reminding us that we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, the more we notice those winks, the more we'll start to see the intricate web of connections that runs through our lives and through the entire universe.
Well, I've got to say, this deep dive has definitely given me a whole new perspective on synchronicity. It's got to be thinking about the nature of reality and where I fit into it all. And for anyone listening out there, if these ideas intrigue you, I really encourage you to start paying attention to those seemingly random coincidences in your own life. You never know what message the universe might be trying to send your way. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into synchronicity, and until next time, keep exploring.